Thank you for joining Morning Star today. Bible study is now underway.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for tuning in again. It's always good to be here on this Bible study night. I'm glad to have again with me tonight Bishop Andrew Randall here joining me. Like my tag team partner from last week. The reviews were so rave, man. It said, if you're going to come back, bring them back too. So I said, I'm trying to come back. But I really do appreciate you, man, taking time out to come and hang out with me while I do this. It's, two heads are always better than one, they say, right? And so I just appreciate this. We've been talking about first things first, and we're talking about relationships, and even on last week, talking about this notion of loving everybody and those kind of things.
Yes.
And I thought that one of the words I see so liberally used, and I use the word liberally, maybe I should say loosely used, but so liberally used is this notion of friends.
Yes.
One of my favorite songs would ask the question, how many of us have them? But it was not just that. It's that notion of, how do I handle friends? Because I have, I'll never forget when I reached 5,000 friends on Facebook, I couldn't get any more. And so I had a lot of people, so I had to delete one to get the other and delete one. And it was a trip because I was full. My friends I was at capacity with all the friends I could have. So in order to get another friend, I had to delete a friend, right? And so somebody sometimes makes, I think, the tragic mistakes of thinking everybody who's their friend on Facebook is their friend. And so as we talk about, this beginning of the year, new things, we talk about priorities. And first thing first, one of the things I think as we do, even starting the year, we clean up, one of the things we had to clean up, I think, in our lives is our relationships.
Absolutely.
And I don't know that there's sometimes even maybe more important, but a more influential relationship than what we like to call friendships, right? Yes. So I want to talk tonight about this notion of friends and what that really means, and some people even get offended because they say you put me in a friend zone, right?
Right, yes.
And I thought friends was a good thing, to be in a friend zone seems to be offensive to some people, right? But I want to talk a little bit about that tonight, and I thought maybe as a jumping off spot, we look at this text in John chapter 15. In John 15, there is a word that I like for us, at least just to take a look at. And for those of y'all who are following us, it's John chapter 15. We're going to read verse 12 through 15, right? And it says that this is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have. There's that word again from last week, loved you. Greater love have no man than this. And here's the key. That a man lay down his life for his friends. That gives you a sense that friends mean something different, right? Life for his friends. Ye are, Jesus is talking, my friends, if you do whatsoever I command you. And finally, he says, henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth. But I've called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father have I made known unto you. That's a deep text. There's one more in Proverbs 17:17. I think is also worth looking at for folks who are mad about being in the friend zone, right? It says, friends love through all kinds of weather, and families stick together in all kinds of trouble. The King James Version, though, says, a friend loved at all times, and a brother is born in adversity. Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
So I want to just talk a little bit about who is a friend. What is a friend? Because so many of us, I think, if we're not careful, we run the risk of confusing folks who like our posts to be our friends, right? Or folks who sent us a friend request, right? Mm-hmm. There it is, to be our friends. So, but I think the difficulty becomes, and what may be a little controversial for let's say a young person trying to understand the Bible clearly, is this notion of Jesus says, lay down his life for a friend. Now, I've seen some misguided people who join gangs and do other things. Yeah. Under the notion of these tight relationships. But what does it mean to lay down one's life for a friend in your biblical estimation?
Well, I think when I'm glad to be again here with you, Pastor Jackson. I think this notion of friendship and laying down one's life, relationships to some degree are always sacrificial. Whether it's a job, whether it's a relative, there is this notion of a giving of oneself. And I think when we consider what the Bible requires of us in terms of relationship, there is always going to be a level of sacrifice and a level of reciprocity. And so I think ultimately, if I call you friend, the privilege of that status means that I have made some investment of you. So to give something of me to you or for you is a laying down of sorts of my life.
Right. So when we talk about laying down one's life, it literally suggests prioritizing someone else's needs, desires, wants, whatever the case may be. But some might mistake that, I should say, for God requiring me to make sure all my friends are before me, put myself before my friends.
Yes.
So does God require? Is Jesus suggesting that we not just lay down our lives for our friends, but does he require me to put friends before myself? I'm a young Christian trying to figure this thing out. He told me last week to love my neighbor as myself, which means I got to love myself, right?
Right.
But what does that mean for where my friends go?
Right. Right. Well, I mean, because this idea, if you look at it in the literal sense, Jesus laying down his life, he went to a cross and he died. And I think, unfortunately, even today, there are many of us who, not necessarily in a physical sense, but in the sense of being true to ourselves authentically, we give a sort of death to that person under the auspices of friendship. You know, we talk about this idea of the social media kind of construct of it, and we call those persons friends. But I've always kind of had this thought with social media, it provides an opportunity for people to talk about you, but not necessarily to you. And so when people spend more time talking about you, those aren't friends, those are fans or followers, like celebrities. They're not our friends, we talk about them. But if they don't have the capacity to talk to you, then they're not close enough with you for you to be concerned about a problem, I believe, with them.
I saw a picture the other day of a what appeared to be a gazelle.
Okay.
And I saw a picture in the background of that picture of a lion. And the caption said, "Everybody following you is not a fan." And so I say that to say that sometimes that we mistake who real friends are and what real friendship means. I know we were talking about a book called Understanding Male Friendships, right?
Yeah.
Where I think Jeffrey Greif, I guess it was, who wrote this book, he identifies 4 categories of friends, right? He says you have must friends. He says you have trust friends.
Yes.
You have rust friends, and you have just friends, right?
Correct.
And so I want to just unpack that real briefly, real quickly before we move on. But he says you have these must friends, right? Those are those folks, if I'm read it right, that you got to have in your life. What you call them, ride or dies, right?
Yeah.
And so those must friends are the folks who show up for you as you would show up for them.
Yes.
They're there in the times you really need them, right?
Right.
And those are the folks I suspect he suggests that we must have in our lives in a healthy way that gives us a good sense of what life is really about, right?
Yes.
But then he says there are trust friends. Tell us about the trust friends.
So trust friends are people that effectively they have enough integrity that they've demonstrated to them that you have some degree of confidence in them. Again, you trust them, you're comfortable. You're happy, obviously, when you see them, you're glad to see them, you can relax around them, but they're not necessarily in your inner circle. It may be a colleague or somebody with whom you have an admiration, but it's just that you don't necessarily have the time to be the kind of to develop the kind of friendship with them that you would have with maybe a must friend. And we have a lot of relationships like that. Sometimes these come into the space of maybe a mentorship almost. Someone, they're not necessarily. Whereas a must friend, anything good happens, I know I feel free to call them, share that with them. I don't have to filter. If I feel blessed, I don't have to filter. If I feel low. and the trust friend is not quite at that level, but they are generally somebody I have an admiration for, and I trust that whatever level of vulnerability I have around them, I trust them enough that they wouldn't take advantage of that.
Right. But they're that kind of friend that if you had more time, you would hang out with them. Right. So there's this must friend, and then there's the trust friend. Then he talks about the rust friend, right?
Yeah.
I thought about that when I read the rust friend. 'Cause I got a lot of rust friends, right? Rust friends are those folks who go back with you from back in the day, right?
Right.
They y'all go back like, I don't even know what, right? And they're folks who high school buddies.
Correct.
People I grew up with in church as a kid who haven't been around maybe in 30 years or more.
Yeah.
So that those old school friends, those rust friends, those are guys that when we get together, we played football in high school, we talk about one of them games we play. So it's not like we're talking about anything that's necessarily up to speed. I have some rust friends who like fraternity brothers too, right? Sure. And we talk about when we were in school, right? Right. Everything is going to be about. We go to homecoming and talk about the same 12 stories every year. They're good people, but I don't really have we don't have the time to be around each other anymore. Much of what our life is about together has been more about history than it is about anything in the future. Correct. So those rust friends. And so, but then he says that you have must friends, trust friends, rust friends, and I'll throw you the alley-oop. You help me with just friends.
Which this idea of just friends, it's really people with whom my mom would probably define them as associates.
Right.
It is what attracts you to each other is your commonality of place, whether that's working out at the gym, maybe it's at church, maybe it's even at work. But as soon as the thing that is the commonality between you goes away, so does the friendship. It's like people, it happens very frequently in church. You think these people are your friends. Oh, yeah. But then as soon as, someone moves their membership to another church, suddenly this person that you saw every week and seemed to be a vital part of your kind of coming and going is no longer even in that space. And in fact, if they're just friends, you're good with just seeing them in that space. I'm your coworker. You ain't coming to my house for dinner. You go to church with me. Yeah, I'm not trying to go with you to the buffet after church. Just, and I just high-fived you. You was my neighbor, I high-fived. Right. You know what I'm saying? We sat in the parking lot and talked, but that's about it.
Right. But, and I see this thing, and as we talked about that, and I'll go to the next thing, but I can't help. Somewhere during the pandemic, I was reading something, during the beginning of the pandemic, I should say, that talked about friends, and it said you have these circles, right? Yes. So there was an inner circle, then there was a middle circle, and then there was an outer circle, right? And, of course, in that inner circle, they said you're not going to have many. If you have 5, you're fortunate, blessed, or lucky. Sometimes folks only have 1, but that's the person, as you said, the must friend, that you tell everything to, right? Yes. That you really know you can depend on. Sure. And then it suggested that in that middle circle, you have folks who you like, right? Who you enjoy being with. They're good friends too, right? Sure. But you edit your conversation sometimes. Y'all hang out and go to lunch, but there's levels of emotional investment that you don't have in them that you have with the folks in the inner circle, right? Absolutely. But then they talk about these people in the outer circle, right? And they still, interestingly enough, still consider them friends, but you got a relationship with them, but there's not necessarily a deep connection, right? And so when they started talking about the outer, the middle, and the inner, that's just kind of a description. But what I thought was most important is that they began to ask the question or suggest to us, be sure you don't have the wrong people in the wrong circle. Right? And if you do, there could be people in the middle circle that you don't want to tell what you tell the people in the inner circle. And they talked about, that article talked about the fact that, can you imagine making the mistake of telling an outer circle person some inner circle information, right? And the kind of tragedy that happens, because we're careful. We loosely use the word friend. So I think that's important to think about, to have some sense in your own mind of who goes where in your life, right? Sure. Who you assign to what, because it's not their choice. It's your choice. It's not their choice. Right. So I think that's important as well. But does together and having friendships mean we're together forever? That's my boy. Right. Been knowing you. Yeah. We day one. But does that necessarily mean together forever? And I wanted to talk about that because I think sometimes I have styled it as people come into your life for reasons, and some people come into your life for seasons.
Sure.
And if you mistake a temporary person and put them in a permanent place, that may not be their fault. That may be yours.
Yes.
And the investment you put in a temporary person, who's there? Don't get me wrong, for a season. But when that season is over, so is the situation, right?
Yes.
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think there are some what I call red flags and some green lights, because there comes a time, perhaps, when it's time to move on, right?
Yeah.
And I talk sometimes about being stuck at a green light and that kind of thing. When you see these red flags, sometimes there are warnings of that. So let's talk a little bit about, friendships, like when it's time to end one.
Sure.
How do you know it's time to move on? When is it time to end it, right? And we talk about that. When it's time to end it, maybe we talk about how to end it and perhaps when to mend it. Because sometimes you don't end them. Sometimes you have to mend them, right?
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about how we end friendships.
So I think it's always important to understand that when we use that term like ending it almost sounds like discarding. But I think what people need to understand is it's more of a transitional. It's not that you discard the person, but it's, as you say, you recognize that perhaps in one season you were in a more intimate space with me, but as we evolve, we understand that people who were in certain categories no longer fit there. And one of those ways is when we know that you have more history than you do destiny. You talk about the rust friends. And so if our entire friendship is always, in our current context, is always like a time warp or a time capsule, or the only thing that we can talk about is mess and things that are going on, then I begin to understand that in one season of my life, this was funny, and I could spend a lot of time, and we could do that. But where I am right now, this doesn't feed me.
Right.
So I've spent an hour with you on the phone or however we're together, and all I got out of that was a walk down memory lane or an update on who is doing what in people we used to know.
In the past.
Right.
Right.
It is not progressive. It is not feeding where I am going. And in fact, you will discover in that friendship, this is how you know there's tension there, whenever you want to discuss something forward-facing or reaching, they have little appetite for it. They want to. They're only comfortable talking about what happened. Yeah.
So one sign, one red flag, one or maybe green light, I don't know which one you may call it, is when you have more history than you have destiny, right? And what about another sign?
I think another sign of that is when your interests, frankly, just become adversarial. Because, again, we're all works in progress. We're all evolving. And it's something about when your appetite changes.
Yeah.
And your interests become divergent. Things that I'm trying to, so for instance, someone, if someone is moving forward and they're talking about doing better financially, doing better emotionally, doing better physically, spiritually, whatever, and the person that you normally used to hang with, they don't want to do that, then you may have to reevaluate and adjust that friendship. We have that happen in church a lot. Right. If you and I, we met each other, our thing was we hit the clubs, we hit the street, we got high, we got drunk, and then, you found God in a different way and wanted to experience a different life, and now every time we together, I'm like, man, forget that, let's do this.
Right.
Our interests are now divergent, and it's not that you don't love me, and it's not that I don't love you, but the path that we're walking, they're not consistent that we're going to help, but where you're going to get where you want.
Well, there was an old saying that someone used to say that if you're not on my way, you may be in my way. And I think when you say the relationship or the interests have become adversarial,
yes.
I keep thinking about everything's like if you have a relationship with a friend, everything's like being in court. That, it's always like a debate, or it's always got to be a discussion and that kind of thing. And now you're trying to get more W's than L's, and, you're keeping record with, did you win the last argument and all?
Right.
At some point that ceases to be interesting or fulfilling, quite frankly, right? And so I have always said, before you get to that, when you get to the point where there's all these W's and L's, one of my pieces of advice is learn how to take the L, right? Sure. Because sometimes it's the L that gets you out of that, right? And it's tough, because I always think that when you're gifted, particularly in the context you talk about two friends who may be Christian friends.
Sure.
It's hard to take an L because it's tough to be gifted by God and still have people who reject you, who are not trying to trend in the way you're trending, right?
Absolutely.
You have that gift. You had you feel like you had all the right criteria and everything, but pride cannot understand how in the world a door can be closed, how in the world, as good as you look, as smart as you are, how in the world, I'm too gifted, to not get what I want, right? And so pride believes that if you want it, you should have it, right? And pride says, with my resume, with the way I am, if I go after it, I ought to get it, right?
Absolutely.
And pride, I think, is one of those issues that messes us up because pride says that when I open that door, when I knock on that door, the door ought to open for me because after all, this is me. But I warn folks that pride will keep you held hostage in a place where you have no longer a season, that you have no longer a reason, but pride has to figure out why it didn't work out. Rather than being able to, as Jesus said, shake the dust off your feet and move on. But pride says, I'm not walking away until I find out why it didn't happen, why I didn't get it. But I want to say to folks, notwithstanding what age, but I know certainly young people need to come to grips with the fact that you got to learn how to take the loss sometimes, right? It looks like a loss initially. It doesn't matter how gifted you are. It doesn't matter, what God's done in your life. You need to know that every job you get will not be prosperous. Every situation you go into is not going to work out. Every relationship not going to work out. Every friendship's not going to work out. Everything you desire will not always be peaches and cream. You're going to make some bad decisions, but get up and get over that. You got to learn how to move on. And don't let pride paralyze you in a circumstance that keeps repeating itself. Sometimes you take the L and say, I'm just going to take the L. And for some of my friends, I got to say that means, hey, once you know it's an L, get out of there. Don't argue. Quit begging. Quit pleading with people. Listen, pack your stuff up and hit the road because you've taken that L, but life still goes on. Right?
Pastor, you preached about this actually a couple of weeks ago, and you mentioned the conversation that God has to have with Samuel with respect to him weeping over what God has over Saul and what God's rejected. There is a part of taking the L that when it comes to friendships that we cannot underestimate in the sense of loss, and it's the grief behind it.
Right.
Because particularly when you've had when we talk about young people, we all think everybody's supposed to like us. Everybody's our friend. And it's always little kids. They're crying. They won't let me play with them. How could they not like me? I'm nice. Right. But then as you get older, it's a different kind of dynamic in the sense that we've been friends for 20 years. How are we not friends anymore? That sense of rejection or the evolution of we're in different places now.
Right.
There is a natural grief that comes with that. And if you're not careful in managing that sense of rejection, you perhaps will internalize it and it brings you to a place of grief that God himself has to pull you up out of.
And not only that, I think the other piece is this, that if you stick around too long, then that grief never dissipates.
Correct.
You keep rehearsing it where, sometimes in order to get on with it, you got to get out of it, right?
Correct.
In order because if you stay in it, you'll never get over it very often, right? And so sometimes your grief has got to happen from a distance from that situation.
Sure.
And so, I say to folks, don't beg, don't plead, quit pulling up, quit driving by. Some stuff you got to deal with the L, take that grief. We were in, I forget what year it was, it had to be somewhere around 2018. We were in Oklahoma City, and Pastor Harry Blake and we had gone into a men's restroom. And he said, I got to go to the bathroom. So I go to the restroom too. And so we both were at the restroom, and we were standing at the stalls. And we were just sitting there, and when we were ready to finish, when we finished, right, I noticed that I had finished, and Pastor Blake was doing this, looking around. And when I came to figure out what he was doing, he was looking for the handle to flush the urinal. And I said to him, Pastor, no, you got to back up. And when you walk away, it'll take care of it. It'll, you know, and I think about that sometimes things don't work until we walk away from them, right?
Yeah.
And so very often things begin to work out for us when we walk away from it. So, you know, I think we got to figure that out. But if we're going to end it, I think how you end it is important as well, right?
Agreed.
Because I don't think every end has to be, what's the right term?
Bad.
That's a good word. Yeah.
I don't have
That's a short word.
Short word, bad.
Yeah.
People, so like breaking up, you know, or whatever. So people like we gotta fight in order to break up. It cannot be. I just don't think this is gonna go where I want it to go and just break up with you. No, it gotta be. I gotta create some artificial conflict or problem in order to do that, because I think one of the struggles we have with ending it, Pastor Jackson, is the fact that sometimes loyalty is a liability, like Abraham Lot, you know, like you talked about the counting, the wins and the losses, and it really wasn't. Abraham would not get rid of Lot until Lot was fighting for his stuff. None of it was his, causing trouble that he had to constantly get him out of. But I'm doing all this because it's my boy.
Right.
God told me from the beginning, go by yourself. I had to have him with me.
My nephew.
And every time I kept trying to do something, it was costing me, and I didn't know how to let that go.
Right.
And so whether that was grief, whether that was whatever that process was, that part of finally getting to the place after conflict, I'm ending this.
Right.
Go your way.
Right.
And I'm going mine. I think oftentimes it's like, you know, as being in church, we understand this. It's like people, if they decide they want to move on, whether it's from a church, whether it's from some kind of relationship, they can't just move. It has to be, I hate you. You've done this, done this. You need like 17 things you've done wrong, and you're like, well, okay. It wasn't just that you wanted to move. You had to.
Well, you know, and some people have been mad a long time.
True.
But they've been waiting for a last straw event, right? Yeah. Waiting for, because they don't have the courage to just tell the truth and say, no, I'm not fulfilled. They're waiting for something that said, you know what, that's it for me, right? Because that gives them some sense of it was somebody else's fault, rather than taking ownership of the fact that I was tired of that, right? And saying I decided because of that rationale. So I think, you know, how to end it, a lot of folks create this artificial conflict, as you called it, because it then gives a rationale to just kind of be angry and walk away, like it absolves you of some other responsibility. Sure. So, but what happens when it's not the time to end it? You know, I talked about red flags and green lights, but what happens if it may just be a yellow light? Yeah. Right? Yeah. How do we mend it, maybe rather than end it? Or when do we know you should mend it rather than end it?
Well, I think it does take a certain level of emotional maturity to understand that conflict. I mean, teeth and tongue fall out, as they say. And just because there's been a disagreement, that doesn't necessarily mean the end of a relationship or friendship. But so when you consider that, is the problem or the issue you're dealing with, is it a petty thing? Is it small? Are you really making a much about nothing? Is it pride? Is it really you? You know, do you have the ability to look at yourself and say, you know what, I'm saying it's them, but really it's some things I haven't dealt with? Or is it the issue that you're talking about, is it passing? You know, so is it petty, is it pride, or is it passing? I think if it falls in one of those three categories, you at least have the building blocks of being able to mend the relationship.
Right. Some things are small things. Some things may be me. Yeah. And some things, you know, if you leave it, it's like Dr. Caesar Clark used to say, some things are like brush fires. You let them alone, they'll burn themselves out, right? And some things are passing, as you say. I think that's important to do that, to understand that as well. Listen, I know we don't have a whole lot of time yet, but I wanted to talk about the fact that, you know, again, friends, there's confusion with who friends are. I think you said something earlier, and I wanted to talk about the fact that there are characteristics so that everybody can examine your relationships to see if you're in a relationship with a good friend, because sometimes relationships become transactional, and sometimes they are very one-sided in the sense that there are folks who are around you for as long as they can get from you. Yes. Right? And so if we had to give the folks who are watching a list of characteristics of a good friend, what are some things you think we might say?
Well, going back to the John 15 scripture, laying down one's life for a friend. So we understand, I believe, that the first principle or a principle of friendship would be that friends love sacrificially. It is hard for the relationship to be beyond superficial if I am only your friend at my convenience.
Right.
There is always going to come a place in our relationship where I'm giving of myself and it costs me something. I think that's what qualifies somebody to ultimately be your friend. I've heard it said, you were talking about Facebook earlier, and they were like, well, how many of those people, if I had a flat tire, could I call? That's your friends.
Right,
You got 5,000, how many of those could you call?
Yeah. And how many of you really even know, right? So,
correct.
Right. What else?
I think not only do friends love sacrificially, but I think they accept unconditionally. Now, we get in trouble with this because people equate acceptance with approval.
Right, and that's not the same thing. So, in other words, when you are my friend unconditionally, if I find myself caught up in a bad situation, you still love me, you're still my friend. Doesn't mean you approve of what I did,
right?
But you're still my friend.
Oh, absolutely.
Unconditional love means, I may not have done what you did, but you're still my friend, right? And that I'm not going to cut you off because you may have done something that I didn't like, right?
Correct.
Gotcha.
In fact, your friend should be the person that is in your life to be able to tell you, hey, I don't agree with what you did, but I'm not going to abandon you just because you've done something like that. And I think that's so critical because oftentimes when we talk about what makes you trust someone as your friend,
right,
it is the fact that even at my worst, I mean, it's easy to be my friend when everybody's proud of me.
Yeah. But where you when they throw me under the bus, right?
Or I jumped under the bus,
deservedly.
deservedly.
Let the bus roll over me, right?
know?
Yeah. So, I don't know that there's anything more. I think the scripture said it in Proverbs 17:17 that that brotherhood is born in adversity.
Absolutely.
That's my iteration of it, but that it takes adversity to solidify not just friendships but relationships, because I want to know where you stand, not when, as you said, things are easy and those kind of things. Listen, there's an old saying that people say, well, I'm with you when you're right. Well, if I'm right, I don't need you with me, right? But what about would you be with me when I'm wrong and you got to correct me and love me through the correction as well, right?
The brothers would understand that it takes a grim interlude for us to see who we really are.
Exactly right. And and sometimes it's like that, that it's not until that time that you kind of do that. And so go ahead, next thing.
So and then friends trust, completely. Because there is an imposter syndrome, a dishonesty sometimes in friendships, because if I am more afraid of disappointing you, then I'm going to perform for you, rather than just be. When God talks about this, is a different type of relationship, but God talks about Adam and Eve being naked and unashamed. It really speaks to a capacity for, can I be vulnerable before you, and not be brought to a place of shame. And what's critical about that is, even though again it's a different context, in a romantic sense, more people are they're nude before each other, but not naked. And so the fact that I see you undressed, that's nudity. But I can see that, and they'll still never see you. And so the question is, do your friends actually know who you are, or do they know who you've let them believe you are? And so I cannot develop trust outside of that environment. And when that trust is broken, that's a very difficult place to come back from.
And I just can imagine that there's so many people who are not satisfied with themselves, and so they perform for other people. And the folks who like their performance, they prescribe to be their friends. And so they keep performing for those same friends because, but when the music stops and the dancing stops, adulation, then they're left to remember that you're only their friends as long as you're entertaining them, right? And it's, again, I go back to, that's a transactional relationship. It is not something that's feeding both of us, right? If I have come to figure out how to feed you, then it doesn't even feed me. And at some point that gets old, right?
And
dysfunctional.
Sure.
And I become a candidate for abuse at that particular time, if not already a victim of abuse, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that was important as well. But what about trust, right? If I'm a friend, right? There's a saying that a friend is a person you trust completely, right? That means it takes a while to develop a friendship, because just being acquainted with somebody.
Agree.
When you start talking about trust, you mean with what, right? And real trust is like with everything. And I don't have 10 friends like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That
Right.
trust with just everything.
Correct.
Right? But what a blessing to have people like that in your life who you could literally trust with everything. And I think that's where you start to qualify and maybe in some instances quantify, who your friends really are. Trust completely. I'm concerned sometimes about the length of time it takes to have complete trust, in all kind of relationships, but certainly in friendships. I think
Sure.
you want to trust,
Yeah.
but trust is something I think that you can't pray for. It's got to be earned. You don't hear people saying, God, please let them trust me, right? No, you have to earn trust. That doesn't come from heaven. You earn trust among your friends and those folks in which you're engaged in relationship. And when you lose it, it takes a lot to get it back, right?
It does.
And so, but you got to always be working on that, because without that, one might argue that there is no real friendship and or relationship. Does that make sense?
100% makes sense. I think there's a when it comes to fostering trust with people, I think you have to address your own sense of brokenness relative to, what that means to trust people, because like oftentimes, so that in Jeffrey Grief's book where he talks about understanding male friendships, one of the things that happens to us, particularly in our cultural context, because of the absence of fathers, right? What I discovered even about myself and the kind of the things that I endured, I struggled to trust men,
Right.
because who's feeding me? It's mama. Who's that? It's mama.
Right.
Where was that? Okay, and then you get into spaces that evolves. Inherently, there's something in you that says, guys don't really show up like that unless you play football.
Right.
Partners show up for you.
Join the
Get
gang.
frat,
Right.
they show up for you. Gang,
Right.
they show up for you. So it becomes a very transactional type of trust. But so it's very, so you have to address that kind of brokenness in you.
Right.
Because otherwise you'll project that into someone or onto someone else, and you have to deal with that. You know what I'm saying? So
I guess the question then, and I know we got to wrap up, but the question then becomes, can trust and trauma occupy that same space? Do I have to deal with that trauma before I could ever really trust? And as I do that, then I'm eligible now for friendships. But sometimes trauma makes me ineligible for friendships in the sense that I cannot trust.
It does.
And perhaps I don't feel like people can trust me. And so as a result, the authenticity of my friendships may be called into question,
I agree.
Appropriately. So, right? Listen, man, I appreciate this conversation. We got to finish this next week. I want you all to know I appreciate you being here this evening and for tuning in, and look forward to being back again next time. Thank you, Mr. Randall, for being here with me.
Thank you.
And just ask us before we go. Let's pray together. God, how we thank you now for this day and for being a God who loves us more than we even can love ourselves. But God, in creating us, and as you have shaped and formed us, you've made us creatures of reciprocity. So you give us families through which we are born, but then you give us the privilege of making friends. I pray, God, that we would be keenly aware of what it takes to have friends, and then remember that your word advises and guides us to know that if we would have friends, we got to first know how to be a friend. So God, teach us how to be a friend, that we might be able to be trusted by others to be their friends. And then God, give us the sense of knowing what a must friend is, who a trust friend is, what rust friends are, and never to confuse those who are just friends. That God, we be blessed because of those relationships. And I pray that you bless and foster those relationships that exist in our lives, strengthen them even now, that we might feel and be a part of the kind of joy that you prescribe for each of us as your children. God, until we come together again, we pray for your blessings for those connected to us and all those who've been a part of this conversation. We ask it all now in the only name that really matters. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for joining Morning Star today.